to the firestorm over the president's deal to give up 5 top terror suspects for Sergeant Bowe Bergdahl, a soldier held in Afghanistan after he walked away from his unit. That's what the Army concluded in 2010. In the middle of questions about whether Bergdahl was a deserter, there was reporting from the Army Times tonight, quoting sources that said Bergdahl not only walked away the night he was captured, but actually walked off base a couple of times previously. Brad Thor is a New York Times best-selling author with extensive contacts in the military and intelligence worlds, and he is the author of the soon-to-be-released book, Act of War. Brad, thanks for being here tonight, and I know you've written a piece saying that the president has just put a target on the backs of all Americans. Why do you believe that?
Well, I believe that, Megyn, because in our 200-plus years of American history, we've never traded prisoners for hostages before. And I want to be really clear about this. Susan Rice, the things, and you've discussed this earlier on the program, what she said on the Sunday talk show, that he wasn't a POW. This was a hostage. And the idea that we now will trade for Americans, whether they be military, whether they be diplomats, and even citizens, this is going to be what the terrorists want to do. What we saw with hijackings in the 1970s, we will now see with American citizens, American military personnel around the world. And I would say this, actually I think American citizens and diplomats are at greater risk than military personnel are, because Bergdahl stumbled away, walked away from his own unit. So that doesn't happen that often. That was a one-off. That was lucky for the terrorists. But to grab somebody in London, grab them in Paris, grab them in Amsterdam, that's going to happen, and every American should be terrified about that.
What are your sources saying in terms of their thoughts about Sergeant Bergdahl? Because his defenders point out that he was promoted twice while he was in captivity, although our Pentagon sources tell us that that's standard unless you've determined in advance that he's a deserter. Nonetheless, one of his platoon mates on another network tonight suggested that prior to being held captive, prior to going missing, he said within days of Bergdahl's disappearance, military teams monitoring radio communications intercepted radio chatter and other chatter indicating an American was searching for Taliban members who spoke English, and he went on to say this. Stand by.
He's actively seeking out the Taliban, so at least we know that. And yes, over the next couple months, all the attacks definitely were far more directed.
So what are you hearing?
Well, I'm hearing that when he was found by the Haqqanis, it was a happenstance situation. They found him. He was in the presence of what was described as 2 or 3 Afghan soldiers, and that he was, to use the Pashto word, dewana, which means intoxicated. So there seemed to be some conflicting things we're hearing here, and I don't know how soon after he failed to appear for muster that the Haqqanis found him. But the big thing, and you picked up on this last night, and I think it's important, Megyn, and Andy just talked about it. You have made the proper distinction. Bowe Bergdahl was not held by the Afghan Taliban. He was held by the Haqqanis. And in my article on The Blaze, I describe the Haqqanis as 80% Sopranos, 20% Al-Qaeda. That's kind of their makeup. Haqqanis are about money all the time. When the Haqqanis kidnapped New York Times reporter David Rode, they wanted a bunch of money. They also wanted, a little bit down the road, to get some prisoners back, and that was under George W. Bush. And the answer was absolutely no way. If the New York Times wants to pay you a ransom, that's between you and the New York Times. And when the Haqqanis were told no prisoners, the Haqqanis upped the money that they wanted from the New York Times. Now, what doesn't make sense in this whole thing is that if you had a hot scoop, you wouldn't give it to CNN and say, well, I'm going to give it to you, but make sure you promote 5 people over at MSNBC. You'd get nothing from it. The Haqqanis got nothing out of this deal, as we're seeing it with these 5 prisoners. There's got to be money here, whether the White House directly paid the Haqqanis or caused it to do it through a third party. I'm telling you, there's money here, and they need to be pressed on it.
Brad Thor, thanks for being here.